Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We are very pleased to welcome back Denise Findlay to continue our conversation on raising resilient children. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle. To everyone participating today, the topics we cover can often be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure you're taking care of yourself. If you need to talk to a friend, elder, counselor, or relative, please make sure you do so. So, introductions. My name is Cole. I'm from the Chewethil First Nation. I'll be facilitating the session today. Other team members in the room, but not on camera, are Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Jordan, our assistant coordinator. If you feel so inclined, please introduce yourselves in the chat box. For anyone who missed our first session or needs a quick refresher, Denise was born and raised in North Vancouver to a mother of European descent and a father of Coast Salish heritage. She's worked in over 120 First Nations communities and organizations throughout Canada, including her own community, the Squamish Nation. Although most well known for her pioneering work in the area of lateral violence, Denise's focus is on facilitating personal and community empowerment, development, and wellness. She holds a master's degree in education from Simon Fraser University, focusing on contemplative inquiry and approaches in education, and currently holds a faculty internship under Dr. Neufeld at the Neufeld Institute. So with that, I want to welcome you again, Denise. I'm really excited to talk to you again and dive back into the topic. Please take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, it's exciting to come back, and I know that the last time I was here, the topic is pretty vast, and I feel like I went through a lot of material in a very short time, so this just gives us an opportunity. I'm hoping today to just sort of dive in a little deeper. I cut back the slides. I'm going to review some of the more, I think, salient points, and then there'll be room for a little bit more discussion. And as I said before, the topic of resilience is such a it's a hot topic, and a lot of people are using the terminology. And I think what I love about Dr. Neufeld's understanding of this particular construct, the construct of resilience, is that it's really looking at how to build the capacity of a child or a person, not how do we manage that symptomology. And I mentioned that the first time, that we're really looking at, or another way of saying it, I think, is it's not what has happened that matters, but what doesn't happen in response to what has happened. So it's less about controlling situations and circumstances and more about how do we respond now? What can we do now? Regardless of what has happened, because we can get quite hung up on events of the past. And especially as parents, I think we carry a lot of guilt. I think the parenting journey is fraught with guilt. I think that's a very natural part of parenting. But we as parents can also get stuck in feeling bad and trying to make up for the past, when we'd be much better off and more freed up if we just focused on, okay, how do I build resilience in my child? How do I help my child recover and bounce back? And so again, the analogy of the bouncing ball, that resilience is really this capacity to bounce back and the capacity to return to what we would call optimal functioning. And optimal functioning, when we think about that, means that we're adapting to things that are happening in our life, that we are bouncing back when something happens. And that includes the grieving process. Adaptation, in intuitive language, adaptation is really a process of letting go. Grieving is a process of letting go of the things, the futilities of life, the things that we could do nothing about, the small things and the big things. And adaptation requires a very soft heart, which means the emotions have to be moving in the limbic system appropriately. And if we have not been able to bounce back from an event, what that tells us is that the resilience of a child or a person was compromised long before the event. We often think that the event is what broke us or broke the child. if we know what to look for, we can see that resilience was compromised far before an event happened.
Right.
If the resiliency is there and the event happens, it doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Of course, it's messy and emotional and sometimes noisy, especially with children who've had trauma. But what we will see is a letting go process and a bouncing back. Mm-hmm. Rather than a stuckness. And I know you have a question about stuckness, so we'll go more into that. Mm-hmm. What does that look like? How do we know? But adaptation, grieving, recovery, healing are all part of the journey of resilience. So that capacity to bounce back, that capacity to let go, to have our tears, to feel our deep sadness, our disappointments, and to move on from the things that we could do nothing about and not stay stuck in them. Right. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. I mentioned this during the first session, but I think it's really important to remind everyone that how do you know when there's resilience? It's simple. You see there's a playfulness, there are feelings that are moving and registering. We can feel our sadness, we can feel our joy, we can feel the vulnerable emotions. And there's a deep rest that comes in the nervous system, and I want to highlight rest is not sleep. You can be sleeping and not resting. Mm-hmm. During times of stress, as a sleep defense, you can be sleeping and not remembering anything but feeling exhausted. So when I say rest, there's a rest in the nervous system. The nervous system is not at work all the time. And I will go into that a little bit more when I talk about intensified pursuit, one of those primary emotions that I mentioned the last session, that resilience gets compromised when there's no rest in the nerve. The system is at work trying to fix something or keep us safe or protect us from something or whatever the case may be, keep people close. And that's a big problem with our children today, and the level of restlessness that we see. You see a restless child, that's a red flag. That's a sign that there's probably some stuckness there. But there's things we can do about it, which is the good news. If we can see it for what it is, there's a way through. And that's the wonderful thing. We don't have to stay stuck in sort of the perplexing nature of the symptoms, if you follow. Because it can be perplexing, especially for people closest to the kid, going like, what's happening? I can't make sense of this. It's overwhelming and I need help. Help me figure out what to do here. My goal in the work I do is to really empower the people in the child's life, the natural village of attachment, so that we don't have to continue to rely on the experts. Not that we don't need experts and not that we don't need the doctors and all of these people, but it's a slippery slope when we start to just sort of hand our kids over and say, I don't get how to do this, fix it. I mean, parents and family members in the village of attachment has to play a central role in that. And I think when we think about the legacy of residential schools, one of the most harmful outcomes of that was that our parents and our families were disempowered in terms of being the answer to children. And I still see that belief running in some of the families I work with, that someone else is better for the child. That we don't know how to do this, that we're not the answer, someone else knows better. So a lot of the work in terms of resilience is re-empowering family members to say, look, it's not about skill level, it's not about how much education you have, it's about you seeing yourself as the answer to this child, because that child is attached to you. You're their parent, you're their grandparent, you're their aunt, uncle, cousin, whatever. And you don't have to have all the answers, you just have to see yourself as the answer. There's a good analogy that Gordon uses, and it makes a whole lot of sense to me. And I know that in my travels with my kids, wherever we've been, I mean, we've done road trips and we've flown over to Italy and, gone on all these adventures. And it didn't matter how lost I felt at times. We got lost in Italy lots of times, and I'm thinking the GPS is not helping. And I don't know where I am, and I don't know where I'm going right now. But I would look at my kids, they didn't have a care in the world because they felt at home with me. And I was the answer. And as long as they were with me, they were home, and that was the answer. And they weren't alarmed by it. So it's attachment's kind of like that.
Right.
It's not about having all the answers, because I didn't. I'm like, where am I? And oh my goodness, I feel really lost and overwhelmed in a country where no one's really speaking English, and hard pressed to find someone to communicate with, to find my way. But the kids didn't feel lost because they had me, and they felt safe.
Yeah.
Even though I was a bit lost. Does that make sense?
Oh,
so that's kind of how it works.
Yeah.
So, and that's what I want parents to know. It's not about having all the answers. It's about knowing you are the answer to them in terms of their resiliency, their capacity to heal, recover, develop, become all that they can be in this world, and reach their potential.
Yeah.
I talked about these primary emotions last time, and I think it's worthwhile going over again, because these are archetypal solutions or patterns that all mammals share. And our limbic system works the same way as all the other mammals: dogs, cats, bears, wolves. We all have this system that basically is there for survival purposes. And when we're under times of stress, separation being one of the biggest forms of stress. And actually, I would challenge you just to take a moment and think about stress and the stress response. You can take pretty much any stressful scenario and boil it down to some form of separation. Whether it's a physical separation from someone or something that matters, or an emotional or psychological separation you're experiencing because of your perceptions of a situation or a person, or a potential hypersensitivity. It's a hard word to say. Hypersensitivity to a potential rejection, loss of your job, like every stressor you can possibly. I challenge you to think of a stressor that doesn't involve at its core a form of separation, whether it's personalized or not.
Right. And that separation, does it have to be a separation from external attachments, or it could be a separation of like an internal state, perhaps?
Absolutely.
Like separation from feeling joy, or perhaps a separation of your peace, perhaps, Like, this is going to stress me out. I'm separated from it. Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, so sometimes we anticipate separation. And we try to cut it off at the pass.
Right.
We might anticipate separation where it's not even happening.
Yeah.
And so our own thoughts about a potential situation can cause that stress. Our own perceptions. I know for children who have had trauma and they haven't had an ideal beginning, their self-perceptions cause separation. I'm unlovable. Nothing works for me. Everywhere I go, it breaks down. No one likes me. I'm a bad kid. So you've got children that are stuck in what we call the separation complex. And a complex it can explain a vast array of symptomology and manifestations. The list goes on and on. But we can explain the manifestations, the behaviors, the reactions as rooted to one source. And so when we say separation complex, that means that separation is actually at the core of when we're looking at mental health problems, behavior problems, learning problems. Yes, kids are born with, sometimes there's an organic brain injury, or there's autism or FASD, or there's disabilities, or there's things that we can't necessarily do anything about or change. But the separation a child experiences as a result of those things, or in the context of their relationship with their closest attachments, can exacerbate and get the child even more stuck. Because you can see children that have, again, I'll challenge you just to reflect on this for a minute. We can have children that have autism or have different kinds of disabilities or challenges that are thriving. So what are the conditions that allow that resiliency versus children? We can't just say, well, it's the autism, it's the FASD, because some kids with those conditions are absolutely thriving because the whatever's been offered in the relationship, the attachment needs, have been met, which allows the brain to recover and find what we call workarounds. And you know what, this is really fascinating to me, but they've done studies in a lot of the research in terms of the emotional brain versus the cognitive brain has been done on animals, because it would be unethical to do those studies on humans. And so they have wiped out the prefrontal cortex in rats, for instance, right, to see what happens. And what they see is that the capacities that develop normally in the prefrontal cortex will actually develop in a different part of the brain if the conditions are right. So the brain is always looking for the right conditions for recovery to occur.
Right. Yeah. Using its innate plasticity, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's, you can have damage or something going on in the brain, and these fundamental and basic capacities for human relationship, to be an emotional being, to bounce back, to recover, that doesn't get compromised. It's still always possible, no matter what has happened. So these three emotions that we share with all of the other mammals are there. As I said before, they're there for a reason. They're really important. They're for survival purposes, and they're meant to move us. And when they're able to move us, there's healing that occurs. There's recovery that occurs. And they really, for kids, can only move in the safe context of a relationship with a loving adult, where there's an emotional attachment. So I'll go over them quickly. We could talk about these emotions all day long and really unpack it and really come to understand it in all its different forms. But I'm going to just give you the Reader's Digest again.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So pursuit, intensified pursuit, is an emotion that moves us to close the gap between ourselves and someone we're attached to when we're facing separation. And so a very simple example would be, I know for me, when my kids were little, I would be there giving them all the attention in the world and filling up their cup. And they would go off and they'd be content and they'd be playing. And I think, okay, now is a good time to make a phone call. And the minute I got on the phone, what do you think happened?
Tugging.
Pursuit.
Yeah.
Because now I'm no longer available. They're facing separation. And for little ones, any kind of separation is hard to tolerate for very long.
Right. Yeah.
And so then they're mommy, tugging at me and tugging at me and tugging at me. And then I get off the phone and give them attention and they're freed up again. So that's how pursuit works. It moves us to close the gap between ourselves and those that we're attached to.
Right.
And it's meant to move us in that way. But pursuit, when you think about that particular emotion, is an emotion. Whenever any of these emotions are at work, our nervous system is at work. And that's really important to understand in terms of resiliency, recovery, healing. When our nervous system's at work, there's no healing or growth. It's only when these emotions are brought to a place of rest. And they can really only be brought to a place of rest in I'm going to say three ways, because play is a huge part of that. And we'll talk about play a little bit more today than we did last time. But these emotions are brought to rest, especially for children, when they are given more than what they need in terms of their attachment needs. So when they can find rest in the relationship, a great example would be, I play this game with my kids. I've always done this. When they say, I love you, I say, I love you more. And it brings a little bit of rest to the nervous system, because the brain gets flooded with, I don't have to work for this. It's unconditional. It's there. I can take this relationship for granted. And our children, more than anybody, need to take their relationships for granted. And in those little moments of rest, there's recovery that happens in the brain.
Right.
So attachment brings rest. An unconditional invitation to exist in my presence brings rest. The other thing that brings rest is when we haven't been able to keep people close, the ability to find our tears and have our tears and meet the futility of the situation and have it register in a really deep way that there was nothing I could do to keep them close. And now there's nothing left to do but cry about it. And in the wake of that, there's rest that comes from that, and there's healing and growth and recovery that happens in the brain from that place.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mentioned play. Sometimes there are certain situations that are too intense or too, actually, let me rephrase that. Dr. Neufeld said this to me once, and he stood beside me when he said it, and he said, you know, Denise, we're not meant to face things head on, our shortcomings, our traumas. If we can look it straight in the eye, we're probably a little stuck and a little defended. Mm-hmm. But what we can do is we can look at it in the periphery. And that's really what play does. Right. Is that it allows a child to work through and allow these emotions can move in play because it's indirect and it's safe and it's consequence free. Right. And so play brings rest. Not only does play bring rest, but a child at rest is more likely to play.
Right. Yeah.
Because they feel freed up. It's like freeing up of the energy when there's rest in terms of these emotions. Mm-hmm. So pursuit, intensified pursuit, understanding that. I also use the example if you've ever lost your cell phone or if you've ever lost your child, if you're a parent, that's pursuit and that's how it feels. And when pursuit hits, I tell you, there's nothing else you can think about.
Oh, yeah.
That's all you're thinking. It's moving you and everything else goes away. Mm-hmm. So imagine as adults, if that's the impact it has on us, imagine the impact it has on children that don't have capacity, right? And there's some children that are never satiated. They've had so much trauma and the parents are not able to be present and they're in a constant state of facing separation over a long period of time. And this is where we get into finding kids who become very, very stuck. Because their brain is working to protect them. We talked about frustration last time. That is another really important primary emotion. When something's not working, frustration moves us to affect change. A lot of people working in the helping field are very frustrated because they can see the potential and we're working for change, and so we're often very frustrated. A child who has faced separation and they're full of pursuit, often, like my little guys, when they would come after me when I'm on the phone and then I would get off the phone, what I would sometimes see is the frustration would come out immediately after. So these emotions are so powerful, you only really experience one at a time. Right. And they displace each other. And the third one is alarm, which is intended to move us out of harm's way, move us to caution when we're in an unsafe situation, and it happens very mechanistically. This is not a cognitive process. They move in us, and they're meant to move in us very unconsciously, and they're there for survival purposes. So we all have them, but they're meant to come to a place of rest. We are not meant to stay stuck in those ever. And in terms of the story of resilience, anyone working with children, it's really important that you recognize these things for what they are. I think that we get stuck on the whole behavior thing and we're like, that child's doing that on purpose. But if you can ask yourself, it's not that the child is trying to make something work. It's that there's something that hasn't worked that's led to that. So don't ask what's the child, because that's called instrumental theory and it's been disproven that, I hear people say that child's testing, they're trying to do this. No, ask yourself what hasn't worked that's caused that, and get to the antecedent. Because if we think about that for a minute, if we see a child and we say that child's doing that on purpose, intentionally, versus what's gone wrong, what has happened that has led to this? It's a very, very different come from.
Absolutely. Well, it shifts it almost, when you say that child is doing something on purpose, it immediately puts the child almost as a culprit of their own behavior, right? Yes. Whereas, especially with children, at least from my personal experience, you're the expert, absolutely. But,
Dr. Neufeld
is the expert, sure. But, I firmly believe that a child is a product of their environment, especially when they're so young, right? So Yeah, sorry, continue.
It just softens the approach. It softens the comfort. It endears us to the child. And part of what they need is they need a reduction in separation. They need to feel safe. They need to feel satiated. They need to feel flooded with our love. And Gordon always says every child needs at least one person who's absolutely crazy about them. An untainted relationship. And I think traditionally grandparents played that role. Yeah. But you know what? A lot of our grandparents are parenting our kids now. Yeah. And so they're wearing a double hat. And our kids don't have that one person in their life. So remember, the stress response when we face separation and during times of stress, these emotions move more, but we experience less feeling. And so the difference between emotion, we all have emotions, but we don't all feel our emotions. It's the ability to feel and have those emotions register that allows us to function better during times of stress. But we're only meant to do that in bits and bytes. We're not supposed to stay stuck in this place.
Right.
And again, when you see a child who's had a lot of trauma, but they are very low affect and very cool as a cucumber, that should actually be a bit of a red flag for people. I would rather see a noisy, messy child crying or having a tantrum. Right. That tells me the emotions are moving, and then we can come alongside. So the adaptive response, I wanted to go over this again. I like this image because I think it really, picture's worth 1,000 words, but there's this draining that happens, the tears that I talked about, when things have not worked, when we haven't been able to be safe, when we haven't been able to close the gap and keep people close, when we haven't been able to affect change, we must have an encounter with the futility of the situation and know there's nothing left to do here. And we must have a drain of those emotions or a release. Actually, Gordon was saying the other day that they used to equate emotions with steam when they talked about emotion. Right. But now what they realize is that emotion, it's electrical. It's an electrical impulse in the brain. And so these impulses move in us, and there is meant to be this release of emotion that happens, a release of energy, basically. Not like steam coming out, but like an electrical charge.
Like a discharge.
Yes, exactly. And so when our heart is soft and if we feel safe, we're able to feel the deep futility, like the sadness of something, the disappointment of something. And we're able to come to terms with that in such a way that we can have our tears and that the brain can recover. So every time we go through that journey, the brain, and I said this last time, shears off the old neural pathways and new ones are formed. And in essence, what the brain says is, look we survived that and we're going to be okay. And the more we have that experience, the more our confidence in ourself builds and we start to believe more and more in our own organism. And as we develop and our personality develops, that's really, in essence, what resiliency is too, is believing in one's capacity to survive whatever life throws our way. And, life is fraught with unpredictable things. Right. The good and the bad. We have the good, but then the bad also. It's inevitable. It's inescapable. And so focusing on building resiliency as opposed to, like I said, symptom management and reacting. Yeah. Or trying to control every circumstance. And when I see parents doing that with kids, trying to control the circumstances in the environment, that's not an overly protecting a child. I don't want to say that the wrong way because I think sometimes parents also think, well, push the child out there more and that's going to develop resiliency. It's really that dance between knowing the child and saying, what is this an experience that's going to lead to greater resiliency? And how do I help with that? Or is this an experience that's going to cause alarm and stress and get the child stuck? Right. And knowing the difference between those two. Yeah. But that hourglass is really important to understand. And when we're in the midst of a stress response and the emotions are moving and we've lost the feelings, this process gets compromised. And that's why that symbol
Mm-hmm.
It gets stopped,
Yeah.
basically.
So we have a question
Mm-hmm.
from, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, Nusha B. I like what Denise said about the emotions moving. It's a beautiful metaphor. The emotions are not moving. You have a child that is stressed but acting cool as a cucumber. How can we get those emotions flowing again?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. The first thing I would say is it seeing yourself, if you're working with that child or you're the parent of that child, seeing yourself as the one who can help,
Mm-hmm.
seeing yourself as the one that is going to be the safe person for this child to attach to, and looking back to the beginning, resorting back to really the roots and saying, I know that in order to help this child, there has to be an attachment relationship. Now, is this child attaching to me? What are the signs that this child is attaching to me? Or who are they attaching to? Or what are they attaching to? Because
Right.
sometimes our children reattach to inanimate objects, or
Right.
or routines, or pets, which isn't so bad. Pets can be safe, but we cannot parent a child whose heart we do not have. And so we need to resort to the beginning. Now, I don't have with me today the attachment roots, but you're really asking yourself, who does the child seek to be with?
Mm-hmm.
Do they seek to be with you? Who does the child emulate or seek likeness with or sameness with?
Right.
Do they emulate you? Do they seek to be like you? Who does the child give belonging and loyalty to? Do they take ownership over you? Do they say, this is my teacher, this is my mom, this is my dad, this is my? You can tell the language people use if they're attaching at that level, because they say, you're my this, or you're my that.
Right.
Do they give you loyalty? Do they take are they moved to take your side?
Mm-hmm.
In a given situation? Do they seek to matter to you? Because this is huge in terms of how personality develops and self-esteem, is when a child reaches that stage of wanting to matter. And what are all the different ways that a child seeks to matter? And it could be very subtle. And so we have to be looking for the tiny little signs. These are not big things.
Mm-hmm.
Do they seek to give us their heart?
Right.
Do they tell us their secrets? Do they come to us and tell us the things that are troubling them? And do they want to be known and understood by us? And do they want to know and understand us? So you look at that and you ask yourself those questions. Say, is this happening in this relationship? And if it's not, pointing your arrow in that direction with that intention that first and foremost, before you get to work at anything, that you are inviting this child into an attachment relationship with you, that you're safe, and that you're saying there's an unconditional invitation for you to exist in my presence. This bond will never be broken, and there's nothing you can do that will break it. We as parents struggle so much with presenting as what we call alpha to our children that sometimes the relationship gets inverted, and we have parents seeking their needs to be met in the relationship with the child.
Right.
And looking for the approval of the child and trying to appease the child.
Right.
And this is very backwards. Yeah. It's not safe for children when that's happening. And so for us, we have to really stay in the lead. Mm-hmm. There's a lovely, I think, actually, I'm not going to say whose little story this is, but it's an old, quite a well-known story about the old man and the son. And it's a wonderful way to think about the defenses of a child, and helping, finding a way through to get that child back and inviting them to melt into a relationship with you. So in the tale, the old man is walking and he has a coat on, and the sun and the wind get into an argument about who can get the old man to take his coat off sooner, more efficiently. And the wind says, oh, well, I can blow and blow and blow and blow this jacket off the old man. And the sun says, okay, well, go for it. Give it a shot. And so the wind gets to work blowing away. And what does the old man do? He clutches the coat, being the defenses of the child. He clutches it tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. So he finally gives up, and the son says, okay, let me give it a shot. And this is your role as an adult. If you can use this analogy, this will be very helpful. The son slowly steadily, gently becomes warmer and warmer and warmer. So much so that the old man doesn't even really notice that he's getting warmer and warmer and warmer, to the point where he just feels warm enough that he decides to take his coat off, and he removes it. And that, if parents, teachers, anyone working with children can understand that that's the role you play. You're the sun for the child, and you're slowly warming them and melting them. And it's very indirect. It's very indirect work, and it's so important. The dance you do with any given child will be unique. You have to know the child. You have to get to know their interests, their likes, their dislikes, their food preferences, what they like in terms of music, what their interests are. And go through and find a way through with any given child. It's going to be a different path. But again, if you stop asking how, this is really hard for people in this day and age. It is so difficult because we have been trained and conditioned in higher education to know how to do things. This is not a cognitive thing. It is an intuitive dance. If you can abandon the how and just say, I don't need to have all the answers. All I know is that I have a deep yearning, and that I'm presenting as the answer, and I have faith that we'll get through. It just shifts the energy. And I've seen it. The proof is in the pudding. I've seen it over and over again, not only with my own children, but with the hundreds of people I've worked with that really have been able to embrace a different way of being with kids.
It's a beautiful story, and it really does serve to illuminate kind of what we're trying to get at, the underlying theme of what we're trying to talking about, all of these concepts, right? At the end of the day, it comes back to your relationship and just kind of just being that source of warmth, so much so that the child has to let go of whatever it is, right? Being stuck in that loop. They take themselves out, right? Because they feel so warm and attached and loved unconditionally, they don't need it anymore. Yeah. You know what I mean? That constant, let's just use pursuit as an example, that constant pursuit, they don't need it anymore. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the defenses melt. It's not a conscious choice. The brain, it's a mechanism in the brain. Yeah, and it's a lovely thing when it happens. Yeah. It's very, very satisfying for everybody involved. And sometimes the adults are melting in that too.
We'll just go back a little bit into this we have a question from Julia Joe. I was talking about those that kind of pursuit and frustration. Yeah. How can we work this into a child's behavior plan if they have one at school? This concept.
Yeah, I think there's lots and lots of practical things that you can do when you're working in a system that requires these kind of written plans and you're trying to provide strategies to people. I think that you can first of all, I think being able to speak some of this language and share some of these ideas with a team of people working with children is really, really important. But in terms of practices, there's no practice at the Neufeld Institute that we will say yay or nay to. Right. And so it's about, if you're going to have a practice, for instance, if you have a frustrated child that can't tolerate a lot of separation and they're having a lot of meltdowns during the day, understanding that if a child with an aggression problem is facing too much separation and that they haven't developed the integrative functioning to temper their aggression, which means they can't think twice. The emotion of frustration just takes over and they react. Okay? And that's where the aggression's coming from. So if I can give you an example, like a real example of a younger child that was having, 30 meltdowns a day in school, that they had they'd been in care and they hadn't really been able to put deep attachment roots down. I mean, first of all, helping that child attach to the teacher is really, really important. But in terms of a tangible piece, I want to give you an example that this child was becoming attached to their caregiver, but they were still kind of insecure in that attachment. It hadn't gone deep yet. It needed more time. And so whenever they faced separation from the caregiver, they would be full of pursuit. They would be full of alarm. They would be full of frustration. And so one of the things that the teacher would do would help to reduce separation by either having a picture of the parent or reminding the child, look, you only have this much time left until you're going to see the parent again. And so those are like really practical, tangible things. If you have a child that is needing to have an outlet of frustration, I know in working with Diane, who's the play therapist at ISMN, through our discussion, she created a frustration corner. And so she has a box of all these things that if children come in, they know that they can swear, for instance, but they also know that they can go somewhere and like rip paper or pop bubble wrap or throw something or break something. Like there's an appropriate, safe outlet for the frustration, because sometimes it actually just has to come out and they need the help of an adult to get it out. And so, instead of doing like a body break, you can say, okay, you know what? This child actually, we've measured this, we've looked at this. This child can only go this much time without having an outburst of aggression. Yep. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to help reduce the separation, and this is how we're going to do it. If it goes over the top, this is the plan. We're going to take the child over to wherever they need to be, and we're going to find an outlet for their frustration. And allow them to have it in a safe way. Yeah. Because often what we do in a school system is that we take a child who's already feeling frustrated and we inadvertently say, I see you're having a hard day managing your frustration today. Wait, let me give you some more frustration to deal with. I'm going to make you face separation even more. I'm going to send you out by yourself. Yeah. And then you exacerbate the very thing that you're trying to reduce in the child. And so if people have this understanding, there's all kinds of practical things. And I'm most interested in hearing from the professionals, okay, well, what would you normally put in a behavior plan around that? I was working with a BI, a behavior interventionist, with a little guy who had autism. He's just little. So he's in preschool, still about 4-ish. Right. And the BI, I was in a meeting. I mean, I learn things all the time, and my brain's always sort of thinking about creative ways to do all this. And they were telling me that whenever the mom would bring the child in for the sessions, he didn't want to go. And he'd get clingy, and he'd be full of pursuit, and he'd start to have a temper tantrum and throw things to everybody, just in general. Okay. And clinging with his mom. And the BI would say, okay, she would get a timer out and she would say, okay, mommy's going to be here for 1 more minute and then she's leaving. And the child would just go into a fit. Yeah. And I said, okay. Let's look at that. This child's facing separation. The child can't bear the separation. How do we reduce it? Why don't we just, instead of pushing the child's face into more separation and pointing out when mommy's leaving, why don't we use the timer to reassure him about when mommy's coming back? And they were like, huh. Yeah. So it's just a little tweak. Absolutely. It's not about telling people change your practice completely. It's about changing how you see the child and changing how you see the practice working. If that, you follow? Yeah, it's profound. The implications are actually, for practice, are profound. And I think sometimes people think I'm telling them to abandon all that they've learned. No. I'm not doing that at all. I'm just saying it's a paradigm shift in terms of what you see and how you employ your practice, your methodology. That's all. Yeah. Did that help? Did that answer that question? That was a long-winded answer, like so many of my answers.
Yeah, I think we're good. Anisha, just wanted to thank you very much for your thoughtful answer.
Good. Great. Wonderful.
I think we can move on.
Okay. Good. I wanted to share these. I think these are really powerful slides here because it helps us to really pinpoint what are some of the manifestations of a loss of particular emotions. And so when we have, like I said, more of those primary emotions and we have a loss of feeling, we get the problem behavior. And specifically, let's look at alarm, that primary emotion of alarm. That's meant to move us to caution. If the child doesn't feel safe and alarm starts moving and there's a loss of feeling, functioning increases, but then we end up with alarm-based problems. And some of the alarm-based problems are anxiety, anxiety problems. And it's interesting because I mean, we all have some anxiety. I don't think anyone living in this world, in this day and age, doesn't have some form of anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I know I myself do. But I see it in my kids where they get, there's little things that they do or that they're moved to do that it's the brain's way of having them cope with not feeling safe, for instance.
Right.
Little routines. I mean, Max was walking down the street and he's like, I'm not going to walk on a crack. I'm not going to walk on a crack.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember doing that as a kid?
Yeah.
Don't walk on the crack or something bad will happen.
Yeah.
And so you know, I feel safe if I don't. It's a way of feeling like you're in control.
Inserting your control into something that perhaps you don't have control over.
Absolutely.
Right.
And so some of those things are rooted in anxiety. Well, anxiety is rooted in alarm.
Yeah.
And if we know this, which will segue into this whole idea of medications that I'll talk about later. I'm not going to say do or don't about medications, but what I'm going to say is understand what the root is and be working at that simultaneously to reduce alarm.
Right. Yeah.
If a child has anxiety, let's get to the root.
Right.
Let's get to the root of it. Let's bring rest to that child. Let's help them find their tears. Let's help that emotion move so it can drain, so the anxiety can be reduced. Agitation, restlessness. So when you see children who are restless, often diagnosed with ADHD, then that is rooted in alarm. And this really helped me when I heard this. There is a difference between a child who is restless because they are easily distracted versus a child who's restless because they are looking for distraction.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So you see a person, I am a sensitive soul and so are my children, so I am easily distracted. Like I'm like squirrel because I'm taking in all of my world, so makes me actually quite a good facilitator because I can track what's going on in a room very easily because I'm, I see things. But versus the person that can make eye contact, that the eyes are scanning all the time looking for what's unsafe.
Right.
Agitated and restless. Do you follow?
Yeah. Yeah, I see it.
Okay. Yeah. You can see that in people. That is rooted in alarm, not having felt safe. Again, scattered attention. I sort of just talked about that a little bit as well, but attention hijacked by alarm that is not felt. And again, that scanning that you see in people where they just can't settle. You can just see that restlessness in them. Discipline problems rooted in alarm, reckless, careless, not moved to caution. When you have a child that is constantly putting themselves in harm's way, and you say that, what are some of the things you hear about children where there's discipline problems? Like, think about that. What do people say generally about kids who are like misbehaving, discipline problem, reckless, careless, doing things?
Yeah, a lot of those words are used, definitely. The one I heard a lot was they operate without regard. They just don't.
They just don't learn. They just don't seem to learn.
Yeah.
They just don't care. Youth today are so selfish. They need to be taught a good lesson, that we don't have enough discipline. Our kids are spoiled. You need to kick them out. They need to get a job. I mean, whatever, tough love. You need to I've had people take everything away from them. Well, I'll tell you, if you have a child suffering from alarm and there's discipline problems rooted in alarm and you start taking away everything they care about, what you do is you court the not caring in the child.
Right.
Because you're saying, look, I see what you care about and I can take it all away from you. And you get a child who's like, I really don't care. Take it all away. And they will beat us at that game, and it will be at a huge cost in terms of their health, well-being, and development.
Yeah.
And so discipline problems are not what we think they are. Discipline is an internal job, self-discipline. The ability, if our alarm's not registering, we're not going to think twice. And that's why so many of our youth are engaged in alarm-based activities, adrenaline-based activities, because that emotion of alarm is not registering in them.
Yeah.
They are not feeling afraid when they're meant to feel afraid. and they're putting themselves in reckless situations. And you can't teach that. You have to recover the emotion. There has to be some rest. We have to bring that alarm down. They have to feel what they're afraid of.
Right.
Make sense?
Yeah.
And adrenaline seeking, which I just talked about. And I think cutting and burning, talking about hurting oneself, this is all part of that. And people, sort of the predominant idea about the cutting, because it's so pervasive now, boys are doing it too, but I think it's more with the girls still. People say, well, because they want to feel something. They want to feel something. It's actually not because they want to feel something. When they cut and they are flooded with adrenaline, there's in the wake of that is more numbing. And so it's reducing the feeling even more. The question is not, what are they trying to feel? It's what feelings are they trying to avoid?
Right.
What feelings are they trying to escape by doing this? There's something too vulnerable. And again, back to attachment, we have to invite that child into a relationship with us in which the defenses can come down and they feel safe enough to feel whatever emotion they're having trouble feeling so that they can have rest from the alarm. So anxiety is really alarm without eyes, so to speak.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Just like general, like alarm, just feeling alarmed.
But not knowing what the root of it is.
Yeah.
Not knowing what we're afraid of, but having all the symptomology of it. Okay. Should I go back?
No,
sure.
No, we're okay.
Okay.
Julia Jo just wanted to say,
I'll go back.
Very good. I love the change, how you see the child. It was really nice. She wanted to thank you for it. And also commented that the child that is often labeled as a bully or labeled as innately bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's a very good point, and looking at children as innately good, and that we're born with this innate ability for caring and empathy, and all of that is, I mean, there was a belief at one time that we were born blank slates, and that theory it's called the blank slate theory, and that's also been disproven, that unless we were taught to be good, we had to be taught to be good, to not be psychopaths. Now we know that's not true. We are born with these innate emotions, the capacity to care for one another. We don't have to tell a dog or a cat or a bear how to care for its young.
Yeah.
We have the same limbic system. It's innate. Yeah. Okay. So let's look at the emotion of frustration. So when there's an increase in frustration, and there's a loss of feeling, what we get is into these attacking behaviors, and I mentioned that. So tantrums, non-directed eruptions of attacking energy, so just sort of like generalized meltdowns, aggression, physical, emotional, and psychological attacks are included. Attacks that violate our sensibilities, any kind of violence that we see. Sorry, the clock's in the way of that. Self-attack is really important. And again, the topic of suicide, I know, is huge in the Indigenous world. For some communities, it is almost a daily, weekly thing that we're dealing with. Attempts at suicide, talking about self-harm, suicidal ideation. I know it's a touchy subject, but there's a difference between... and this was really, really helpful for me. When I hear, sometimes my son, my youngest, when he's really, really, really frustrated, he's 9, he'll say, I hate my life. I want to kill myself. And what I'm gauging in that is I'm saying, is this rooted in frustration? Is this just an eruption of this attacking energy that has been displaced onto him? Here's the other thing about this. When, as adults, we're working with children who are struggling with aggression, who have increased frustration, and they're full of foul energy, and it's coming out all over the place. If we use pursuit or alarm to try and coerce them into calming down before they've developed the true capacity to manage that, we can displace the emotion of frustration. Okay? And if we displace the emotion of frustration, they will never experience the drain of frustration necessary to develop the capacity to temper their own frustration, the integrative functioning. So for instance, if my son's having a tantrum, and which happens still all the time. And I say, if I withdraw my love from him in that moment and let him see in my eyes, like, I don't want anything to do with you while you're like this, what do you think is going to happen?
Pursuit.
You get intensified pursuit. It displaces the frustration, but the frustration's not gone.
Yeah.
It's going to come back for another round, and it's going to be stuck in the child. And I see this happening a lot. And that's why, like if you can work how to deal with frustration into a behavior plan, great. That's huge. If you can work how to deal with pursuit, how to deal with alarm, this is huge, because you don't want to be displacing these emotions. Because remember, you can only experience one at a time. Now, when you have a child that's saying, I want to kill myself, in that way, that's coming from that place of frustration, I hate my life, I want to kill myself, it's been displaced onto him. He's displacing it onto himself. I would much rather, and I will be perfectly honest, I let my kids stay up way too late the other night. I went in to wake them up for school, and my son swore at me and said, I hate you. You're the worst parent. And I'm like, great. It's fine. I'd rather him feel safe erupting on me than erupting on himself. Do you see? Yeah. And when he erupts on me, it gives me a chance to show him that I'm unfazed. It doesn't change how I feel about him. He's not holding me emotionally hostage with his eruption. And I get a chance to bring rest in that moment. Now, a lot of parents would say, that's it. You can't talk to me that way. You need to be taught a good lesson. And I'm going to push your face into separation. And I'm going to alarm you. And I'm going to frustrate you more. And I'm going to do all these things and displace all those emotions. And often these behavior plans are set up to be unfolded in such a way that there's displacement happening all the time. So like I said, it's not about the practice, it's about the philosophy underlying the practice.
Yeah.
You'll have people say, well, what about evidence-based practice? Well, evidence-based practice is eclectic, and it is untethered from any philosophical understanding of why it works or why it doesn't work. All we're saying with an evidence-based practice is that do it because it works.
Right. We
do it because we get the outcome. Yes. Over and over again, we get the outcome. If you don't have a philosophical underpinning to guide your practice, you can be doing all sorts of things and not knowing why you're doing them or what the impact is. And so with this, that philosophical understanding should be guiding. That means you can do any practice you want. It shouldn't be really an evidence-based practice, but an evidence-based theory.
Yeah. Okay.
And then you can use any practice you want. But the way that our people are being trained now in higher education is around evidence-based practice, apart from any philosophical understanding about why that works and where that came from and what the side effects are.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for those of you who don't know this, Dr. Neufeld was the external examiner for PhD psychology students at SFU and UBC for a huge part of his career. Yeah. And so when he talks about this, I listen up because I think it's so profound to know, wow, we have a lot of professionals doing evidence-based practice and talking evidence-based practice. And I think I used this saying, this analogy last time, and I can't remember. I'm going to have to look up who said it because it's some sage early philosopher that said it. Maybe it's Carl Jung or someone like that. But the right tool in the wrong hands can be very, very harmful.
Yeah.
And that's really what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah.
Yeah. We need to really look. And if you're Indigenous or you're working in an Indigenous context, having a philosophy that is congruent with Indigenous ways of knowing and being, I think, is fundamental. I think that this is part of decolonization. I think it's part of healing. I think we have to stand firmly in a way of being that works for our people. And I can't tell you how many parents I end up seeing that say, oh, hearing this, I feel so relieved because they've been told by other professionals to do things that doesn't fit It's incongruent with their core belief system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You follow? Yeah. I think I went on a bit of a tangent there, which I tend to do sometimes.
No, it's it's got me, got my gears turning. The one I wanted to make a comment there is really when you were talking about allowing the child to kind of to have an external target for their frustration, right? To not allow them to displace that on themselves.
Yeah.
I was just in my mind. I thought, well, yeah, that takes such a strong and developed person in their own right.
Yes.
To be able to take that.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of loops back to what you were saying earlier in terms of working on yourself and accepting and knowing that you are the person. You are the attached person for that child, right? And with that knowledge comes an understanding that all of these things are going to happen, but it's up to you to not rise above it, I guess, but have the emotional fortitude, I suppose, to not look for those. Sometimes one would argue easier answers of saying that's disrespectful. I'm leaving. You know what I mean?
Trying to control.
Exactly. Just trying to exert control or looping it back into that alpha behavior that you were talking about before, right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make that comment. It takes a lot of strength
it's a good
to
point.
do that.
Yeah, it's a good point. So I'll speak to that quickly. I think when, as an adult, you say to yourself, I'm making the choice and the commitment to be the answer for this child. When you make that choice and you make that commitment and you start to see yourself as the answer, I think very instinctively we rise up to the challenge. And it's an emotional piece where now the focus is off of us and our needs and and having our unmet needs met, or whatever the case might be, and placing the focus on the child.
Yeah.
There's something very magical and something very healing that happens in the parent-child relationship or the adult-child relationship when the adult realizes I'm it for this child. And there's a healing that happens and a growth that happens. So we're growing. Parenting, we're not born parents. I've said this in meetings before where we're looking at a parent that's maybe struggling and there's a lot of expectations being put on a particular parent. And I'll say, oh my goodness, this is a new parent. This is a single parent. They've had trauma. We are not born parents. We have a child and we grow into our parenting. We are growing just as much as the child is. And we're coming alongside. It's a relationship that develops. So again, it's a whole different way of looking at this.
Yeah.
And parents need to be cut some slack. I mean, we live in such a complicated world, an overwhelming world. So many more things to deal with now than we've ever had to. And the pressures to do it right are phenomenal, I think. Yeah. Should I go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're good.
So let's look at the emotion of pursuit. When we have an increase of pursuit and a loss of feeling, then we get into what we call fixes and fixations. And I find this one really fascinating just in terms of my own self-reflection. I can see this, that when we haven't been able to keep someone close, that our human attachments haven't worked when we're children, that we can get into all sorts of really complex ways of being and behaviors. And depersonalized pursuits, when our pursuit becomes depersonalized, what that really means is that there's no person at the other end. So for instance, a child who is pursuing their parent by being the best, that's problematic, but at least there's still a parent on the other end.
Yeah.
Okay? I mean, a child should never feel like they have to win our love. They should just feel loved no matter what. If they want to win because that's something that's emerging from within, intrinsically, great. But winning to keep a parent close is hugely problematic. When it becomes depersonalized, what you get is a person that needs to win all the time. It doesn't matter who's at the other end of the equation. And I actually laugh at myself because I'm a 48-year-old woman now, but I think at some point, a lot of my success and my drive was a depersonalization of pursuit energy where I was trying to be good enough. And it dawned on me one day, I kind of went, thank goodness I have some self-awareness, right? I kind of went, who am I trying to be good enough for?
Yeah.
There's nobody on the other end. It's not for my parents anymore.
Yeah.
Who is it for? And that's what a fix and a fixes and fixations are. Like the little hit of winning. Oh, look, I'm the best. I'm the best. Collecting things. Hoarding, dominating, these are depersonalizations, and we can see it. There's no person on the other end. It becomes about something detached from a personal relationship. This is really important. Alterations of self, you see this a lot. I think we all do it, but when children get into this really young, it can become very problematic. They can get very stuck in this. The temptation to change oneself to keep people close, to psychologically hem oneself in relationship to another person. So when we start to edit ourselves, if a child feels they have to edit themselves to keep us close, then we no longer know the child. And now they have secrets about themselves, and there's shame associated with that. And it can affect drastically how the child, how their sense of self develops and their character. And it can lead to an incredibly vicious cycle, and feelings of loneliness, of not ever being known and understood, because we can't attach deeply when we're hiding who we really are, because we think there's disapproval there, or we feel shame, or we think we'll be rejected. We can become very lonely, very disillusioned. The cost of that is profound. I mean, you can just probably get a sense of it as I'm talking about it. And I think in our society today, the conditioning around hiding, it is unbelievable. And I know, working with social workers, when I work with parents, it's incredible the disclosure that happens, because I am just receiving them so fully without any judgment. And sometimes a social worker would say to me, well, they come into my office and then they make up a story about something. And they lie, they lie. And I've had some really rich conversations with social workers about, why do they feel they have to alter themselves in front of you? Because that's what lying's all about.
Yeah.
It's about hiding oneself, true self, to keep you close. So what can we do to make it easier for people to be real, to be truthful, for children to be able to say, this is who I am and this is how I feel, and not hide? Because we can't parent a child we don't know. As Gordon would say, the devil we do know is better than the devil we don't know. And I fully agree with that. I want the good, bad, and the ugly out of my kids. I don't want them to give me what they think I want. Because that's not really who they are. And if you think about the secret keeping that happens, it can be very, very concerning, right? And if we get a little taste of feeling loved every time we alter, it's very addictive.
Yeah.
Because the brain's getting a little hit in that pleasure center, and it can become a vicious cycle. Addictions, unable to feel fulfilled by or feel the futility of a pursuit. And so I showed that addiction slide last time. Whenever we do or don't do something to cut off the emotion, that can be considered an addiction. So if we think about that, if we alter ourselves to secure love, because we can't tolerate the feeling of being unloved, that's an addiction.
Yeah.
You follow?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It
really is the essence. If people understood this at a core level, I think it would revolutionize the way people deal with addiction. It's fundamental. It starts so early on. But this need to cut off our emotions at the past, because we haven't developed the capacity to be. We think the emotion's going to kill us if we feel it, and so we'll do anything to not feel it.
Yeah.
And digital preoccupations, texting, gaming, social media, and pornography. So, pursuit can take these forms as well. It is a depersonalization, I believe. Peer orientation happens with online gaming. My son's game, and I have to make sure I cut them off. So there's an end point to that in their day. Sometimes I let them do it a little bit too much, but they're getting a little hit of something, whether it's winning, being in control, connecting with their friends, being really good at something. I mean, it's all there.
Yeah.
It's
absolutely.
all there.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly addictive, but it is a form of pursuit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's deep. It can become very depersonalized. And I said before, when I cut my sons off temporarily from their gaming, it's like I'm going to say something very, very harsh here. It's like taking like drugs away from a junkie. I'm like, they're having like a full on episode, and I'm thinking, okay, well, we need to ride this out because your brain is in a state of alarm because now you're facing so much separation with this thing that you think you need to fulfill something, and the feelings that are coming up are intolerable, and you're going crazy. So again, knowing how to work with that, and not that I'm suggesting you cut kids off games, because I know that I've worked with caregivers with adolescents who've had trauma and been in and out of care, and they become attached to their games, and they've tried to do cold turkey, and the kid becomes suicidal. So I'm just saying you need to, don't do anything drastic based on this information. Just sit with it.
Yeah.
Sit with it. You have to be case specific. If you have a kid, you need to really look in depth at what's going on with any given child. We talked about alpha. So, more emotion, less feeling. We get an increase in, the alpha complex, which means the need to be sort of that leadership. In alpha in its purest form, we were talking about Donald Trump, and we were saying how people generally think he's a bit of a bully. Is it okay if I say that here?
As far as I'm aware.
I don't really have I'm not a political person, so I don't really have any, huge political beliefs. I'm just going on what I've heard. But, people would say he's a bully. Gordon actually made a really good point that if Trump was feeling his emotions, he'd probably be one of the biggest caretakers in the world because he's alpha. And there's nothing wrong with alpha. Alpha, we need alpha people who are the caretakers of the world, the leaders of the world, but it's when there's a loss of feeling that you get a bully, because now the emotions aren't registering. Empathy is rooted in emotion. And we can't teach empathy, the cognitive approach to empathy, where we're going to teach people how to be more sensitive, sensitivity training. There's actually research that shows that sensitivity training exacerbates the problems. Because it's a cognitive approach to an emotional problem.
Yeah.
So you're teaching the bully how to behave better. But it doesn't change at the core who they are.
You're addressing symptomology at that point.
Absolutely. And so what you get, bullies are often very smart, and so they know how to act in certain situations and what to say and what not to say to please whoever they need to please. But then the bullying takes on a different kind of form. When they're away from whoever they need to behave in front of. Yeah. And I mean, that might be a topic in terms of the empathy stuff, that at some point bringing the bullying aspect into that, because bullying is a loss of empathy. But it's still there and it can be recovered. So alpha, Rye, the bully instinct to assert dominance by exploiting vulnerability. And so when you have a defended person where they're very alpha, but there's a loss of feeling, they are moved to exploit vulnerability as naturally as the emotionally intact person is moved to care for the vulnerable. So for instance, when kids, there's research that shows that when kids start school, their faces are up, they walk through the hallways wide open, up like this. I think by grade 1 or 2, the reports show that all the kids are like this down because it's not safe. The vulnerability is too much, and they are putting themselves in an unsafe situation by exposing their vulnerability at school. Because what happens is the bully, if they detect vulnerability, they're moved to exploit it.
Right.
So if someone's hurting, we should all be very naturally moved to alleviate suffering. Mm-hmm. This is innate. This is part of empathy. We're born with this. Yeah. Even other creatures will help other species. You hear about animal rescues where one creature has rescued another creature. Mm-hmm. We share the same limbic system. When there's been emotional defense of an alpha person and they become a bully, they detect vulnerability and they're moved to exploit it. So parents of children who are being bullied, those kids are just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they're not knowing how to get themselves out of harm's way.
Yeah.
Their alarm system's not registering, because a kid who's got alarm that's registering knows where the bully is and steers clear. Mm-hmm. And in workplaces, how do you know when there's a bully in the workplace and they enter the room? I want to know if someone will be able to answer that. Mm-hmm. How do you know in the workplace if there's a bully around and they walk into the room? What happens? What's the indication? Anyone?
Well, I think, at least in my personal experience, everyone kind of immediately looks to avoid contact and shut themselves down. So using the children as an example, the head down, focus on your work, nobody makes eye contact, mm-hmm. through fear of being seen as vulnerable, mm-hmm. perhaps, and targeted, right?
Everyone sort of stops talking and gets quiet.
The whole thing gets quiet. Everyone looks to isolate connections.
Yes. So this idea that we could teach the bully to be different, or that we can take courses on dealing with the bully, the truth is that the bully needs to be avoided. You need to know how to keep yourself safe, but the bully also needs someone to take them under they need an alpha person. Now, this is really interesting. Franz de Waal, I believe it is an animal. He researches empathy. Mm-hmm. The Age of Empathy is a good book, but he's done the studies on animals. And there is a story in his book about, I think it was a elephant/rhinoceros reserve in Africa, and for some reason they decided to cull out some of the senior, more alpha animals. I'm not sure why that was. I'd have to read it again. But when they did that, what they noticed was that all of the younger elephants and rhinos started to form little gangs and bully the more vulnerable ones. And they couldn't figure out how to deal with it. And it was actually an old park ranger that had worked his whole life in the reserve who said, you need to bring back some of the bulls and the alphas, or the elders. Mm-hmm. And when they did that, it cleared everything up. And a lot of, I think, what's going on here is that I talked about the segregation by ages of elders from adolescents, from youth, that we have, unfortunately, our elders, we are missing